Thank you. Right, that's it. So I'll just make a start with the session for now. So I'm Angelica, and we've got a few other people who I'll introduce in a minute, who are part of the toolkit as well here. So our online and virtual and otherwise technology-mediated actions have consequences and impacts in kind of our flesh worlds, the worlds that we're living in with our bodies. And of course, the same is also true in the opposite direction. And the actions that we take in the world can have impacts and influence on our virtual and online environments. And that means that we live in what some have started to call a post-digital world, where our virtual and away from keyboard selves are hard to disentangle and keep separate. So that means that as people who use smartphones or computers or smart devices, we interact with and produce data on a daily basis. And this data is then used by companies, workplaces, or organizations for lots of different reasons and goals. And in our toolkit, we present some pragmatic opportunities for technology developers, designers, but also third sector organizations, advocates, NGOs, and support workers on how we can interact with these kinds of data intensive systems, or these kinds of digital systems that use our data in ways that center people's safety. And we do that because if we care about computer security, we should care about people's safety. And if we care about people's safety, we should care about abusability and trust. So over the last year or so, and in some cases a bit longer, all of us authors of the toolkit have had related, but sometimes separate conversations about safety, technologies, and feminist approaches to design. And in the last months, we conducted 2 literature reviews, one on topics of trust, safety, and harm and technologies, and the other on abuse, intimate partner violence, and technologies. And following these, we also had 2 workshops with a total of 20 expert participants. So building on this research, we created the toolkit to summarize the findings and to also provide pragmatic resources which can be used for education, for example, in higher education, universities, in computer science, design, criminology, law, or any other related field that touches on topics of technologies and harm. But we also hope it will be used by people who are already working in the tech sector and who want to build safer technologies. And of course, also hope that it's useful for those working with survivors or advocating for and with survivors, or those who have been impacted by this kind of technology-mediated harm directly. So who are we actually in this team? I've done a bit of talking. I'm Angelica Strohmeyer. I'm co-director of the Design Feminisms Research Group at Northumbria University. And we've also got Julia Slupska here from the Oxford Internet Institute at Oxford University, who was really integral to this project happening in the first place as well. And then we've got newly minted Dr. Rosanna Bellini, who is kind of dual Newcastle University, but also recently started at the Intimate Partner Violence Tech Group at Cornell University in New York. And we've got Professor Gina Neff as well, who is also very newly director of the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy at Cambridge University, and Professor Lynn Coventry at Pact Lab Northumbria University, who I think I saw say hello in the chat earlier as well. So if you want to give a wave now as well, she's here as well. We're also got Tara Hairston here from the Coalition Against Stalkerware, who's been super integral to this project as well. Thank you very much. And also Adam Dodge, thank you so much for you as well, from EndTab, Ending Technology-Mediated Abuse, I think. And I don't think Maria is here, but all of the design work on the slides today and in the toolkit was done by Maria Munguambe, who is also really wonderful. So you'll hear a little bit more about the researchers who I've just talked about, and Tara and Adam as well in a little bit. But what we all kind of have in common is an interest in exploring how we can design better and safer technologies, particularly for communities who are often seen as edge cases in traditional security research. So this might include survivors of intimate partner violence or other people who have experienced harm through technologies. And through conversations over the last year, which I think was started by Julia introducing Tara and me, we wanted to develop resources that can be used by technology developers as early as possible in their careers. So really, we were talking about developing educational resources for higher education or for training that could be used across disciplines, some of which I've already listed before, and really any discipline that touches on topics related to technology-mediated abuse, or really anything about technology and abuse. So following those conversations, we saw that the Human Data Interaction Network Plus, which is a consortium of researchers funded by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council in the UK, had a call out for theory projects, which seemed like a really opportune moment for us to come together and work on this project that we've talked about previously. So we wrote Julia Slupska, Gina Neff, and Adam Dodge into the project, who really helped us in our thinking and to deepen our understanding and discussions. And at the same time, I was talking with Lynn Coventry about the possibility of working on a related project, and she made it possible for us to work with Rosie to explore notions of trust in technology development, design, and use, and how that relates to violence and harm. So across all of these different strands and in the toolkit, we frame our project as using a feminist lens to look at human data interaction and the development of data-intensive systems, and with that feminist lens, how we can center safety. So altogether, we worked on different strands to work towards answers to the questions of how can we work towards designing technologies that center people's safety, not just system security, and how do we do that in a way that also provides agency for people who are not traditionally seen as tech experts, but who have vast amounts of technical and necessary expertise to tackle this incredibly complex topic. So as I said before, we had 2 workshops as well with a total of 20 participants, all of whom have different kinds of expertise related to the topic. So we list all of the fantastic participants here as they wanted to be listed for the project. So these include academic researchers, workers in technology companies, advocates to end technology-mediated abuse, support workers that work with victim survivors of this kind of abuse, lawyers, and also people who wear many different versions of these hats at the same time. So just a really big thank you for the contributions that you made. I know some of you are here. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, your thoughts with us, and for being so forthcoming with your insights. Hopefully we've done your comments justice in our toolkit and also in this presentation. So I've already talked about our funders, but the Network Plus also addresses a very specific ethical framework for how we interact with data and technologies. So it's made up of 3 concepts, and it's called the Human Data Interaction Framework. And it talks about legibility, which refers to the understanding that data is not only presented in a transparent way, but in a way that is actually understandable by people, and that we can understand the data that a system has about us and uses about us. So it's not only possible to look up what data is being collected, but also understand what that means and what that looks like. It also then talks about agency, which means that we as people should have the ability to, and the capacity to interact with the system in which data about us is being collected or stored or used, and that we should have power or agency over what happens with that data, how it is stored, how it is used, how it's collected, and what happens with it in the long run. And thirdly, they have this notion of negotiability, which refers to our ability to not only know what data is there, how that's being used and what's being done with it, but also to be able to negotiate this use with those who run the system or who own the digital technology. So that means that if we feel like our data is being mishandled or misused in some way, we should have the ability to engage in a conversation with the system developers or owners to adapt this use of our data. The framework was already extended once before as well. There we go. with this notion of surveillance and resistance. So while not formally added yet, this addition provides further thinking of how we can have more ownership of our data and more power over it, I guess, even when legibility, agency, and negotiability are already kind of being done. So this is, for example, we can resist to our use of data if we feel that even though legally maybe everything is done right, we still feel that our data is being mishandled or misused in some way. So this human data interaction framework is really useful in a lot of ways, but we felt through our feminist lens that it perhaps doesn't cover everything, and it perhaps doesn't always provide space for safe technologies, even if it does talk about the ethical use of data. So for us, we felt that it lacked an engagement with power structures and how our individual personal data relates to the data of others, and how all of these concepts have implications for people's safety, especially those that exist at the margins. So in our work, we centered the experience and needs of those who are experiencing oppressions from systems, society, or legal frameworks, and as such have a unique way of interacting with data and data systems. So these would be these edge cases, but these kinds of edge cases actually make up huge swathes of the population. So we learned from feminist research in criminology and sociology about experiences of violence and how violence is often understood as an ecology and mediated through different kinds of verbal, physical, or coercive control. So, and how that isn't an isolated incident, but rather is felt a part of an ecology that is interpersonal, but also within systems and within wider structures that we exist in. And of course, technologies are part of that system and are part of that ecology and are part of this use of coercion and harm and control. So people's safety is impacted when we interact with data, with databases or other data-intensive systems. And this can impact both our digital and non-digital selves. So while we know that any violence we experience online can have real material consequences for us in our physical, mental, and emotional health. So if we see safety as central to our post-digital worlds, we see it as part of the ecologies we interact with data, which means that we see the impact of data-driven and data-mediated violence on individuals, as well as those around them, such as perhaps their children or the communities that they represent. So ultimately, seeing the issue of violence as an ecology allows us to understand that these incidents are not singular anomalies of use of data or data-intensive systems, and that it is never just one person that this kind of abuse is being perpetrated against. It also gives us space to think about violence and relate that back to technologies more broadly than isolated incidents of harm. To say it simply, and drawing on an established feminist call, abuse of power comes as no surprise. So with our toolkit, we try to build on the HDI framework that already exists, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. We've extended it to use our feminist methods of critique and generative development of concepts. So we do this with two core understandings: that we will never design out abuse of technologies or the use of technologies to cause harm. And two, that everything we do is underlined by capitalism and patriarchy. And taking these two things into consideration, we developed two extensions to the framework that allow us to work with these realities throughout product life cycles, not only from inception to deployment, but also through the iterative use and reconfiguration of technologies after they've been released into the world. So these two extensions are about abusability and trust, which Julia and Rosie will talk about in a little bit. And we have these 6 different resources at the end of our toolkit. We provide implications for advocates and others who support survivors that outline key recommendations to better support survivors of technology-mediated abuse and for engaging with technology companies to improve their services. We've provided a resource for designing for survivors and perpetrators that outlines advice for technology companies and developers, as well as an abusability and secure systems development lifecycle, which provides an outline for life cycles of new technologies. The The fourth thing is that we have 3 case studies that can be used to explore and learn and facilitate training or to help people engage with the topic. And then we also have a resource about taking abusability seriously, which provides tech companies and services a self-evaluation tool of how mature their features are in relation to safety. And at the end, we also provide a guide for journalists covering technology-mediated abuse, which is something that came specifically out of one of the workshops. So I've talked more than enough now. And I'll hand over to Julia first, but you'll hear Julia talk about abusability, Rosie about trust, and then Tara will talk about how to use a toolkit in advocacy and for tech workers, and Adam will talk about using the toolkit in third sector services and support agencies. So Julia, sorry for jabbering on too long.
No worries. Thank you for the introduction, and hi everyone. From good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. Do you mind skipping forward a slide? Yeah. So my section of the toolkit is about the concept of abusability, and this section is primarily aimed at technology designers, but also anyone who is interested in understanding how technology could be designed better in this space and what can be done to, I guess, put pressure, or like how we can think about company actions in this space. So abusability is defined as the possibility that malicious actors might weaponize a system for harmful activity. And crucially, designers have a responsibility to anticipate and mitigate this. So some of you may be, not yet, thank you though. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of usability in technology design, which is kind of how easy it is to use any given device. But abusability kind of plays with that concept and asks what kinds of uses should be restricted rather than enabled in design. And this sort of reframes security's traditional focus on an external attacker that penetrates a system, thinking about data breaches, thinking about firewalls, and thinking rather about how somebody can use a device similarly to the way it was intended. So for example, using a camera to record or using Facebook Messenger to send messages, but doing that in a way that is harmful to others. Okay, now can you go to the next slide? Thanks. And so part of what the toolkit does is it introduces where abusability could be thought about in the product development lifecycle. And so the chart that you see here charts sort of any product from the concept stage where designers are thinking about what the need is in the market for it, and then the requirement setting, which is when designers set out what sort of specific features this product should have. And at this stage, we would argue designers should be conducting a threat assessment for abuse, what is sometimes called threat modeling, thinking already at that very early stage about how a product might be abused. Then, and that also at the design and development stage when that's actually implemented, coded, sort of prototyped. Next, there's the product testing stage where like a prototype of the product might be tested with users or designers pretending to be users. And at this stage, we think the designers should be doing a form of abusability testing. So taking on the persona of an abuser, thinking about how easy it is to use this product for abuse. And that can give you a lot of different information about, even if you're not sort of taking away features, how to document it or how to put systems in place to defend people if that kind of abuse happens. Once the product is on the market, which is the kind of operation and support stage, we think it's incredibly important to have really clear and accessible ways to report abuse and then responsive systems for responding to that abuse. So those are the different stages where abusability should be incorporated. Can we go to the next slide? So crucially, one last thing that I think is quite useful in this section, this is also one of the resources that can be downloaded kind of independently of the toolkit, is we're playing with the concept of a maturity model. For those of you in the industry, obviously this is not a full maturity model. This is a very early kind of attempt at it that could definitely be fleshed out much further. But so what this maturity model does is it allows us to kind of situate different companies in terms of different levels of maturity. So at the very bottom of it, sort of at -2, actively facilitating abuse by, for example, selling products like spyware or trackers, which are incredibly likely to be used by abusers, through to sort of willful ignorance, pretending it doesn't happen, or sort of being really tokenistic, where putting out public relations content which claims to address it without meaningfully taking these concerns into account, through to sort of mature company practices, which meaningfully involve survivors and advocates in designing both preventative measures, but also responses to abuse. And that's really crucial because we can't design, as Angelica has already said, we can't design out abuse. This will never be fully solved by technology. Abuse will happen on platforms, and there will always be a responsibility for platforms to respond to that. And so, yeah, if you want more information on abusability, how we think it can be applied, that is in the toolkit that we've shared. I think I will hand over now to Rosie.
Thanks, and I'll remember to unmute myself because that's definitely happened more than once. So hi everyone, Angelica did a really good job of giving kind of an overview of everything. I'm going to just spend a little while talking very specifically about a concept that many of you will be very familiar with, but maybe not on a critical regard regarding trust. And so, I was going to say, yeah, brilliant. You're already syncing up in terms of my flow. So the reason that it's important to have a look at trust is that when we offer kind of a toolkit, we offer somewhat kind of opportunities to challenge thinking about abusability. We also really need to think about what assumptions we're making about how and why we are helping in this particular situation. And trust is really important because it's a definitionally overstuffed word, and it's got lots of different uses, from being kind of in a position of authority to kind of also being in a position of trust, to also ensuring that something will happen, such as like, I trust that it's going to be a sunny day tomorrow. And what we did was we formulated the fact that when we're thinking about trust, is that actually what we're talking about is that it includes a very positive expectation that something will happen, kind of regarding someone or something's behavior in a situation that involves risk. And as we can't actually predict everything that's going to happen in our lives, if someone does, like, please let me know how you do it, we have to expose ourselves to the risk of uncertainty in our actions and beliefs. And so you have to trust in people, kind of processes and situations. And that's why this really lovely quote by Mary Maxwell actually highlights the fact that, of course, trust is going to underline every single decision that we make about what we do, how we do them, and why. So smart people in the audience will know that abuse necessitates a lot of risk, and trust necessarily involves risk. So, for example, victim survivors have to calculate their exposure to it. Abusive partners or perpetrators decide to put people at risk. And then more broadly, tech companies and researchers such as ourselves, when we put information or systems and data kind of out there, we're also thinking about kind of the risks involved in someone interacting with our kind of system in different kind of a way. So trust has really significant implications when we consider how digital technologies might be used to conduct interpersonal abuse. And when we don't ask questions that we need to about risk, we know that that risk is then necessarily being taken on by victim survivors, because if we're not asking the questions, they're having to, because they're experts in their own safety, or at least trying to manage it, or at least and what we wanted to do is we wanted to explore what had been said about trust, or rather action in the face of risk. And based on our kind of search criteria, which is thinking about a person of concern actively using kind of digital technologies to cause direct harm to another person, we identified a range of different sources of information to look at across the fields of human-computer interaction information science. And we noticed that while there are only a couple of notable works kind of mentioned this, so the two scholars that I've mentioned here talk quite a lot about interpersonal trust between devices, and the role of trust that researchers are placed in when we work with vulnerable populations. It's somewhat a little bit surprising that quite a lot of works didn't explicitly position trust as kind of like an important factor for thinking about research and interpersonal violence, because the main reason that we research interpersonal violence in the first place is trying to identify and better understand it to form solutions or a better grounds for understanding it. And we're not really unpicking kind of the assumptions that we're making around putting out our suggestions as to what we do about it. So we draw on 3 broad implications in the toolkit, but I will start with one that's immediate activity that anyone can launch with straight away about their research or their system, and that's asking the right questions regarding trust around your services, tools, or technologies. So the 3 questions that we had that we kept returning to when we were doing our review when it came to trust in abusability was the fact that is trust kind of being used as a verb or a noun, such as like, are you expecting victim survivors or people that have been targeted by interpersonal violence through digital tools? Is it kind of the fact that they actively trusting you, or are you in a position of trust, and how does that kind of interplay? There was kind of like the lots of W's, which was who, where, and why do we trust? Like, what's the expectation around kind of trust within this? Is someone having to trust a system for convenience, or is it based on their livelihood? And how do we go about demonstrating this kind of trust? So that might be kind of, for example, using a system or avoiding a system. And these kind of questions can be really valuable because they can be used to evaluate how data-intensive systems and the companies who own them kind of talk about these kind of trust. You know, is it, for example, to better understand why they want their users to trust a system? So is it solely to improve engagement, or is it a genuine kind of attempt to improve the safety of people using this system? Next slide, please. Oh yeah, thank you. In the words of Chris Whitty. So as you've probably picked up from the number of kind of scholars in kind of like on the panel, and as we're presenting this, is that tech can't simply provide kind of the answers to the problems without kind of inadvertently creating new ones or kind of exacerbating others. But we found that kind of tech can really encourage us to examine new questions about ourselves and our connections with others, and why we should have the confidence to kind of ask questions of these kind of devices. So the 3-question framework that we had on the other slide can be generated to ask these really essential questions around looking at the abusability of a system and looking at the resistance of a system to being abused as well. So Julia mentioned that she was playing around with kind of the process of a maturity model, but something that is that you can kind of immediately start doing to kind of get to grips with kind of just how your system is being perceived from the perspective of, say, like victim survivors, is thinking about how do they trust your system, that if something goes wrong that someone's going to respond, and can you actually kind of really trust in the process of reporting to lead to an outcome that someone's going to be satisfied with. So it's not just a case of kind of safeguarding systems from being misused. It's also about thinking critically about when you put support or care out there, is that are you really being supporting and caring when you're not thinking about kind of trust from the perspective of the victim survivor, because ultimately that's kind of who we want to be designing these systems for. So these are kind of good questions that you can kind of bear in mind. They're really simple to kind of get to grips with, and they can realize quite a lot of critical aspects about the kind of solutions that you put out there, which I think are really important to kind of engage with as well. So thank you. And now it's over to Tara.
Yeah, thank you, Rosie. Tara.
Hi, thank you, Rosie, Angelica, and Julia. My name is Tara Hairston. I work with the Coalition Against Stalkerware. Really excited to be here and be a part of this project. I'm going to caveat everything I'm about to say by noting for everyone that you will quickly and clearly learn that I am not nearly sophisticated or knowledgeable in these issues to the extent of the co-panelist, but I can at least hopefully speak somewhat intelligently from my perspective, given the work that has been done here and that's being shared today. So I've been asked to talk about how to use the toolkit for either advocacy and or tech workers. And I kind of straddle both lines, but I'm not an expert in either discipline. I've worked for tech companies and I also work in public policy. So hopefully I'll be able to contribute something valuable to today's discussion. A lot of what I'm probably going to be pivoting off some of the points that have already been shared, particularly by Angelica, Julia, and Rosie, and kind of, maybe reiterating a bit, but also trying to put them in the context of those two constituencies that I've been asked to somewhat try and address. So first of all, I'm going to start with advocacy. And I think it's really important for us to think about advocacy or policy in a couple of different buckets. I would not limit it solely to engaging with policymakers or lawmakers or people that make regulations. I would also consider thinking about advocacy within tech companies. And I'll get to that second part in a little bit, but talking to the more traditional advocacy that's done in a legislative or regulatory environment. There's a number of different things that are kind of happening in multiple jurisdictions as we kind of talk about trust and abusability or technology and harm. Some of you are probably very familiar with online harms legislation in a multitude of jurisdictions. UK, Canada are just a couple of examples. And I think what this kind of speaks to is who gets to define what harm is and also what is the potential for addressing that harm. Quite often what we see when we talk about online harm more generally is that it's really kind of focused on platforms. It's really focused on things that could be quote unquote potentially addressed through content moderation and notice and take down and things of that nature. So we're talking about online harassment. We may be talking about non-consensual sharing of intimate images. But I think what sometimes gets lost in these conversations is that policymakers are inevitably interested in trying to kind of get their arms around something fairly quickly and coming up with a solution that they feel addresses the issue. But I think as what's been discussed previously, and as you look through the toolkit, you'll find that these issues are incredibly difficult. They're incredibly complex, and they require kind of a multifaceted solution, and that law and regulation by its definition, when you bring those two things up against technology, doesn't tend to do very well because technology is usually always super evolved past the point at which a law or a regulation may be put into place. But I think it's also a concern about, what's really being talked about when we say online harm. A lot of the issues that we've seen in kind of technology-mediated abuse focus on things about how technology is abused to perpetrate harm. And that's true definitely of what happens sometimes on online platforms and social media, but it's not the entire ecosystem of what we consider to be technology-mediated abuse. So I think it's just really important that to the extent people are interested and are capable and are willing, that when these conversations are happening at a policy level, that you try to introduce those policymakers to this broader ecosystem of abuse and harm that can take place as a result of technology or take place online, and not just the things that kind of come to mind instantly for them. Somewhat related to that is also the fact that sometimes when they're coming up with these solutions that policymakers or even tech companies can sometimes make things worse. And so I think this is what kind of gets to the point of thinking very holistically about these issues on the front end, whether it's in the design stage or, from a policymaker's perspective, when they're writing the bill or doing outreach to kind of inform what types of legislative or regulatory approaches they should consider. It's really important to think through, I may be quote unquote solving for one issue, but causing a whole host of unintended consequences. You all may be familiar with what happened with Apple and some of the technology that they plan to introduce to combat child sexual abuse material, and the concerns that were, respectively raised about how unintentionally that could cause other harms or cause other problems. So it's just an example of the fact that policymakers, just like tech companies, need to think through these issues more holistically, think through the lens of coercive control and abusive personas in order to hopefully have more informed policymaking. I would also, in addition to kind of the online harms conversation, another area that I would highlight from kind of a more policymaking perspective relates to this whole conversation around gender and ICTs, or information and communication technologies, that's somewhat happening at the international level, particularly through subsets of the United Nations. It's interesting because we're talking about government use of ICTs, and unfortunately there's this kind of default that gendered use of ICTs, or the impacts of ICTs on a gendered basis, I should say, is often kind of viewed solely as a rights issue and not necessarily as an international peace and security issue. And for those of you that may be familiar with UN speak, that tends to mean it gets demoted to the priorities that the UN may try to tackle. So I think it's really important, again, to raise and elevate the conversation around the gendered impacts of ICT, that it is a rights-based issue, which I think is an important lens through which to view this context, because rights-based approaches to technology development and deployment is really critical. But I think we also have to be conscientious of the fact that sometimes when something is designated as a rights-based issue, it becomes less important in terms of the prioritization that policymakers tend to consider. And the last kind of more public policy issue that I'll raise relates to this conversation that's always going to be ongoing about we need to have better privacy protections or cybersecurity protections in light of, these ongoing data breaches, in light of all of these ongoing cyber security or ransomware attacks. And I think, again, this is an area where the traditional privacy and security by design paradigms or principles that already exist clearly do not account for abusability and trust issues when it comes to technology. And so, as I think Julia and Angelica have alluded to, the fact that there is this whole universe of interpersonal threats that exists that is not traditionally contemplated by traditional privacy or cybersecurity regimes is something that we really need to try and address with policymakers as well. It's really important to sensitize them to this broader ecosystem of technology-mediated abuse so that when they are calling for enhanced cybersecurity requirements for companies or things along those lines, that they're thinking more broadly about how people are harmed every day, not just when there's a big cybersecurity event. Now I'm going to turn to a kind of advocacy within tech companies. And it follows a lot of the same lines. I think, in the abusability and trust discussions that Julia and Rosie led are really critical to engaging tech companies on these issues. Again, because they tend to have very narrow lenses as well. There's a reason the whole slogan, go fast and break things still exists, because, people are concerned about the fact that privacy and security are not embedded in products. Well, imagine that safety and trust and anti-abusability are not embedded either. So my recommendation for companies is really to look to the work that's been done. One of the challenges that I've kind of experienced in kind of participating in this community is that there's a lot of great research and a lot of great knowledge sharing around these issues, but unfortunately it's not necessarily automatically accessible or it's not automatically visible to the extent that we've seen privacy and cybersecurity. So I think it's really incumbent upon companies to, quite frankly, do their homework and look at the frameworks and look at the research and look at the recommendations and toolkits and things that are already out there and really engage with it in a substantive and meaningful way. And recognize that existing mechanisms within the tech industry don't necessarily automatically translate to issues of trust and abusability. So for example, there is this thing called anti-abuse testing. And if you are not in the industry, you're like, oh, well, there's anti-abuse testing that should cover these issues, but actually it doesn't, because again, it comes from the cybersecurity tradition. It comes from focusing exclusively on third-party adversarial threats as opposed to interpersonal threats. So I think really what's important for companies is to really kind of get grounded in what constitutes this universe of interpersonal threats and how do we try to incorporate that learning within our product development. I think also that it's really important, and you notice this in the quote unquote maturity model that Julia alluded to, is that it's really engaging those professionals that know this space, people that work with survivors, people that work on issues related to intimate partner violence, but finding a way to do that work in not an ethics washing perspective, and also in a way that does not just overtake their time and their expertise in a way that detracts from their ability to do their main job. Because as you can imagine, folks that work in those spaces do not have infinite resources like tech companies tend to have. And we have to respect their expertise, just like we would respect the expertise of an external pen tester or someone else that we would consult on a product or consult for some external validation of a system or something that we're developing. So I think it's really important to not only give that due respect, but also to find ways to engage with them in a way that adequately respects but also compensates for that expertise. And I'm not always saying money. I've talked to a number of advocates who are like, we don't want money. So I think it's really important to engage with them to understand what they need. And a lot of times it might be helpful to give help in kind with like helping them understand some of the technology-mediated abuse issues that their clients may be experiencing, or volunteering your expertise to support their work. So, but really being open and non-extractive in a way of, getting that expertise, not in a way to just say, hey, we partnered with this organization or with this group to show that we care about these issues and not really do anything, but actually to partner with them in a sustainable, systematic, substantive way that benefits both sides. I would also think it's really important for tech companies to acknowledge that techno-solutionism is not always the answer to these problems. You can't just fix these issues through coming up with some new capability or some new tech product. I think it really takes having to go back and, again, engaging these communities more substantively. And sometimes this is true not just for products that are about to come out, but for products, quite frankly, that have been widely deployed and in the marketplace for decades. And that can be obviously very overwhelming, because it's just like the whole privacy and security by design debate. It's like, how do we retrofit trust and anti-abusability into our products after they've already been in the marketplace? But I think part of that comes from not just, it may not always be feasible. As we've already stated a number of times, you can't design out abuse. And sometimes it may not even be feasible to make your products more quote unquote safe. But what I think you can ultimately do, if that is really not possible, is to empower your users to make themselves more safe. Give them the tools to better understand how the technology and the systems work, and give them the knowledge, and not in legalese, not in technical speak, but give them the knowledge so that they really feel that they can take ownership of their digital safety and their digital footprint. And lastly, I will also kind of point to the fact that you can't always translate existing kind of industry models, whether it's, like I've mentioned, anti-abuse testing, maturity models, the discussion of edge versus stress tests, stress cases, automatically to this framework or this universe of issues. That I think sometimes I, as a policy person, fall into this very unfortunate habit of trying to leverage language that someone's going to understand in order to kind of make the point that I feel needs to be made. But the challenge is that sometimes that means that the nuances and the complexity gets lost. So I think it's really important that, for those that are advocating for better safety and trust and anti-abusability, I think those folks are very well aware of the fact that they can't always just rely on the nomenclature and the vernacular of the industry to reach those people. But I think it's also incumbent upon the industry to understand that the terms and the frameworks and the research that the advocates or the academics or others in the space may be bringing to them may not necessarily fit within their kind of world or their ecosystem, but that doesn't necessarily make it any less important. It's really important for both communities to work together to maybe establish a common vernacular and nomenclature, or to, at a minimum, better understand how they can intersect so that we can all do better for the people that use technology every day. Thank you so much for letting me talk, and I'm going to now turn it over to Adam.
Yeah, that's amazing, Tara. I hate having to follow you right now because you're so good at this stuff. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit, just briefly, about the value of this toolkit in third sector services like community service organizations, nonprofits, NGOs, I would say even law enforcement, or any kind of governmental entity, that social service providers, or legal institutions. I really think, strongly believe, and I'm biased because I already really focus hard on this stuff, but that they all should be, anybody that is directly or indirectly working to keep their community safe, or working with victims and survivors of modern gender-based violence or abuse, or elder abuse, or stalking, or trafficking, or bullying, needs to center this idea in their work. And this toolkit does a really amazing job of helping us do that. And I do want to call out, and it was mentioned earlier, that there's a great, very short but very impactful section on recommendations for supporting survivors. So I really, if whether you are somebody who really thinks about and about the intersection of technology and abuse, and centers that in your work, or if this is an area that you're not super comfortable with, these are really really helpful tools and guides. So that's just one. But overall, what I really love about this guide is it's easy to say, oh yeah, let's talk about tech safety, or let's talk about how tech is misused to harm folks. But this actually gives us really concrete tools. One, to be more confident when we're talking about these things, because this toolkit does just such a fabulous job of really highlighting the ins and outs of abusability in tech, and how, and I think really highlighting how it can impact our work and the work that we do every day. Because as we know, technology is required for victims to survive and thrive today. And so unplugging is not an option. So we really need to, especially for those who work in victim services, we really need to be thinking about how that tech can benefit their lives, and how that tech can also be abused to create problems in their lives. So that, moving forward, if we're going to focus on safety in our work, it really needs to be a focus on physical, emotional, and digital safety. And so if we decide to prioritize digital safety, which I hope we all do, then we need to be familiar with this idea of abusability and how we can interact with our communities around this idea. So whether, as I said, whether you are super tech savvy or feel completely out of your depth when it comes to technology, this guide is for you. And just having this working understanding and knowledge of abusability is a game changer. So how can we use this toolkit in our work to really have impact in our communities, or with our colleagues, or with really anybody who you feel needs to hear this, or needs to be thinking through these issues more concretely, because honestly, whether you work with youth or your community safety, or with parents, or with victims, we should be having these conversations. And the real, I think, power in this toolkit for doing that is through the case studies, and how thoughtfully they're broken down as to how to analyze them through this lens of misuse and abusability. And what's great is, instead of using these as tools to talk at folks, it's really engenders this idea of having a two-way conversation, laying out these case studies, asking what people think, identifying, the concerns, or where abusability may exist and what they can do about it, right? Or and carry that forward, even to have further conversations about different examples in their own lives, or you may pull different examples. I mean, believe me, there's plenty. Whether it be, as Tara mentioned, Apple, in addition to the scenario with CSAM that she mentioned, they came out with AirTags recently, and really thinking through using that as a case study, and how a personal tracker that turns all Apple devices into a long-range tracking network could be misused to monitor somebody without their consent, is a really interesting conversation that we can be having. Or Facebook's recent collaboration with Ray-Ban to turn Ray-Ban sunglasses into recording devices by having two little cameras in the upper right-hand corner. So there is no shortage of content to be having these conversations, and to be thinking in sort of an anticipatory way, or looking beyond what's happening right in front of us, but how something like an AirTag or these sunglasses can become an issue in the communities that we serve moving forward. And if we are able to anticipate that through this lens of abusability, then we can actually start preparing for it before it happens. And that's what I love about this toolkit, because it gives us all these resources to really be having these conversations. And so, and listen, all the authors have done just such an incredible job of creating this toolkit and shepherding this forward. And it was just a real thrill to be able to watch them work. So I encourage everybody to read this and start thinking about ways that you can use it in presentations, or conversations, or presentations to your own organizations, because I think there's just so much value here, and the potential is really limitless. And with that, I will turn it back over to Angelica.
Thank you so much, all four of you. Actually, super, super interesting. And thank you for sharing all the different perspectives. And have a bit of a look in the chat, because some people have started responding to what's being said as well. We've talked a lot about the toolkit, but we've not actually showed you it yet. So here's the link that you can use to download the toolkit. And there will be some time for questions at the end. So please, if you have any thoughts or questions, pop them in the chat now, or write them down for yourself, put them in your phones, write them on a piece of paper, whatever you need to do to remember them. But before we go into those questions, we wanted you to have a bit of a look at the toolkit itself, or at least have the opportunity to do that. Thanks, Julia, for sharing the link in the chat as well. So what we thought we would do is put all of you in small breakout rooms so you can talk to each other a little bit as well. And that's maybe also an opportunity for people who are a bit shy about speaking out in a big Zoom room like this. So you can talk to each other, and maybe somebody else can ask your question if you're really too shy to ask the question. Or, you know, you can also definitely put the question in the chat, and we'll answer it at the end. So if you would like to download the toolkit now, Julia's put the link in the chat. And we would like you to go to page 50 and 51. It is quite a long toolkit, but a lot of it is also like title pages, and there's some nice illustrations. So there's not that much text on every page. Don't worry too much. And this is what page 50 to 51 looks like. So this is one of the resources that we've talked about already. And this is the one that's for designing for survivors and perpetrators. And as you can see, it's using dating apps as a case study. So not only does it have, like Adam said, the kind of language to help us talk about this in a conversation, but it also gives an example of a case study of what that actually means in practice. And then as you can see on the right side, it also has a suggestion for how to pick a feature. As Adam said, there's no shortage. And you can look at the different kind of tips we're giving or recommendations we're giving for designing for survivors, and also designing for perpetrators, very importantly, and think about how this feature relates to those kinds of design ideas. So, oops, got lost in the chat there. So yeah, this resource is obviously builds on the toolkit and information, but also very much builds on Rosie and Julia's previous research, Julia's work with survivors and advocates of survivors of tech-mediated abuse, and Rosie's work with perpetrators of abuse and behavior change particularly. So I'll shut up for a little bit. I think Julia's already prepared the breakout groups, so please let us know in the chat. Oh, it should be on the second page, Katerina. If you go on the next page, it should be there. I'm not sure what's happened there. But let us know if you have any issues, anyone else with that as well. Maybe try re-downloading it, Katerina. I'm not sure. But yeah,
I think it splits it. So you don't see it in landscape view in the PDF, it splits it in half. So I think you have to, but there, Rosie, I think just sorted it.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, Julia's got the breakout groups ready. So we're just randomly assigning people for around 10 minutes to have a chat with each other and have a look at this specific guide, specific resource, and then we'll come back and answer any questions that you might have.
I think we're unassigned as hosts, but I think we should be able to go to any room that we want to if you want to join in on a room, or unless you want to take a break.
I'm actually okay.
Okay, I might go and join a room that doesn't have a lot of people.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, all right.
See you in a bit.
Huh, maybe I should turn off recording actually.